Welcome to Introduction to Ecology, Lesson 8. So back in the first lecture, we learned about the biosphere, and we defined the biosphere as all living organisms on Earth, plus the environments in which they live, just pretty much everything on the Earth's surface. Another way to define the biosphere is the zone of life on Earth. And again, that's sort of everything on the Earth's surface. And when you think about the Earth's surface, it's sort of sandwiched between two other layers. The one is the lithosphere, which is below the surface, that's the Earth's surface crust and upper mantle, and then the troposphere, which is the lowest layer of the atmosphere. And so the biosphere is sort of sandwiched in between those two layers, and that's where all life on Earth takes place. Now, in order to understand what's going on in the biosphere, we tend to divide the biosphere up into what we call biomes. And we can talk about terrestrial biomes and also aquatic biomes. Biomes are generally large-scale biological communities shaped by the physical environment. And so they reflect climate variation and variation in environmental conditions, and at least for terrestrial biomes, they're characterized by plant growth forms. Now I want to make a very careful distinction here. Terrestrial biomes are defined in terms of what the plants look like based on plant morphology, not based on plant taxonomy, not based on which plants are related to which other plants. So I think a good example is these two succulent plants. And if you take a look at them, they both look very similar. They're both sort of ball-like, stocky, low-to-the-ground plants. And actually, these are very, very distantly related. They're really not related at all as far as plants go, but they look the same because they've sort of exhibited convergent evolution, where they've sort of grown or evolved into the same morphology, into having the same shape, because they both grow in similar environments. They both grow in very dry desert environments. So again, even though these plants are not related at all, their presence defines a particular biome, in particular the desert biome, because they have a particular plant form. So there's a lot of things living on the surface of the Earth, living in the biosphere. There's plants, there's animals, there's bacteria, there's pretty much all life. So why do we use plants to define biomes? Well, there's a couple good reasons. First, they're immobile. So, if we're trying to define biomes based on animals, we got to find the animals, and they're always running around and hiding and doing all sorts of stuff. So plants are good because when they're there, they're there. They're also really good indicators of the physical environment. We see strong variation in plant form as a function of climate or climate zones, and also as a function of sort of the rates of disturbance. Now you can sort of see this in the picture on the bottom right there, where we have 3 different regions in a larger area, and these regions have been disturbed by fire. And you can see that the region that was disturbed in 1970, 2001, and 2003 looks very different from the region where you only had the disturbance in 1970 and 2001. The fire didn't get there in 2003. And that looks different again from the area that was only burned in the 1970s, or in 1970, where the fire in 2001 and the fire in 2003 didn't reach. And so again, you sort of see these differences in vegetation as a function of the different disturbance regimes. And so that's another good reason why plants are good indicators of the physical environment. Plants are also large and visible, and they tend to be long-lived, especially the plants that we use to describe biomes. And so again, that makes them sort of good as characteristic organisms for defining these different broad-scale regions that make up the biosphere. Now, different textbooks have different biomes. They divide them slightly differently. They may split one of the biomes that's in our textbook, or they may merge 2 of the biomes in our textbook. For our purposes, we're going to focus on the 9 biomes that are mentioned or discussed in your textbook. And those are the tropical rainforest, the tropical seasonal forest and savanna, the desert, temperate grasslands, temperate shrubland and woodland, temperate deciduous forest, temperate evergreen forests, boreal forests, and tundra. All right, so before we can really talk about the biomes, we have to talk about plant form, because biomes are defined by plant form. So it's really hard to talk about what makes up a biome if we don't know what the different plant forms are. The first plant form that you need to know about is deciduous trees. So these are a lot of the trees that you see around here. Deciduous trees tend to grow in moist environments that are seasonally warm and cool, or even seasonally cool and cold up in Canada. And they tend to be on fertile soils. They're on fertile soils because what these plants do is they drop their leaves during cold or dry periods. And so that's kind of wasteful. And if you're not on a fertile soil where you have sort of nutrients to waste, dropping your leaves is not a good strategy. So again, that's why you find deciduous trees primarily on fertile soils. In this region, we tend to think of deciduous trees in these seasonal environments where it's a warm, cool, summer, winter kind of effect. But you also find deciduous trees in environments that are warm year-round, but where you have a seasonal wet dry period. And again, there's that tendency to drop their leaves during the dry period. And again, that's wasteful, so you want to make sure that you have the nutrients to do that. So again, the adaptation that deciduous trees have is that they drop their leaves during cold or dry periods. And so they don't have to maintain that tissue, but again, they have to regenerate that tissue seasonally, and so they need to be able to do that. If we think about the second plant form, this is needle-leaved evergreen trees. And so these grow in moist environments that are seasonally warm, cool, or cool, cold, very much like deciduous trees. But the difference is that they grow on infertile soils. And it's pretty obvious to see why. The adaptation that needle-leaved evergreen trees have is that they retain photosynthetic tissue year-round. So they don't waste all this sort of material by dropping their leaves. They actually hold on to it. And they hold on to it because they're growing in kind of bad soil where extracting nutrients is hard. So you got to hold on to every little bit you get. And so again, they're sort of similar in terms of the temperature, the moisture, but the soil conditions are determining whether you have deciduous trees or whether you have these needle-leaved evergreen trees. The next plant form is grasses and sedges. And these grow in moist environments, also typically in seasonal environments with warm and cool periods. But in contrast to the deciduous and evergreen trees, you find grasses and sedges in areas with a lot of fire. And that's because grasses grow from the base of their leaves. And so when a fire sweeps through, it actually doesn't destroy that plant form underneath the ground in the base, and so the grass can grow back up from there. And that's why you find them in these fire-dominated ecosystems. The next plant form is cacti and shrubs or succulents. These are things like the saguaro cacti, even prickly pears. Not surprisingly, this is probably pretty intuitive to most of you, you find these in dry environments. You also tend to find them in environments that are seasonally hot and cool. So a lot of the deserts in the world do have sort of a warmer period and a cooler period, but they're unified by this very dry condition all year round. And again, the adaptation in cacti is having stems and leaves that contain water storage tissue. They can sort of retain that water and get by in these dry environments because they keep a stock. The next plant form is what's known as sclerophyllous shrubs. And these are probably a little less intuitive, something you don't know, feel as familiar with. These occur in seasonally dry and moist environments where you have sort of a dry period and a moist period. They also occur in seasonally warm and cool periods. And what these plants' adaptation is that they have tough, leathery leaves, which means that they can photosynthesize in hot, dry conditions without wilting. So you find these plants in areas where your dry periods tend to coincide with your warm summer periods as well. The next plant form is forbs. These occur in seasonally cool, cold environments. So, Canada, where it's never really super warm. This is where you find these guys. They are broad-leaved, herbaceous, non-woody plants. And so they tend to do well in the cooler environments where other plants may not do so well. The opposite end of the spectrum, we have evergreen broadleaf trees. These live in wet environments that are always warm year-round. And again, these are evergreen, they have broad-leaved trees, and so they photosynthesize year-round. And that means that they have to be in an environment where photosynthesis is possible year-round, so it's warm and sort of wet and good conditions all the time. All right, so what determines biomes? the plants define biomes. We use plants to say, oh, it's this biome versus that biome. But what actually determines where these plants grow? Well, that basically comes down to environmental conditions and specifically climate zones. And so the two big ones are variation in temperature and variation in precipitation. And so I really like this picture, I think it's from your textbook, where it shows how you get the 9 different biomes as a function of precipitation and temperature. And so what you'll notice is that at high temperatures, not surprisingly, you have your tropical biomes, your tropical seasonal forests, your tropical rainforest. At intermediate temperatures, you have your temperate forests, your temperate coniferous forests, your temperate deciduous forests, your temperate grasslands, your temperate shrublands, and then at the really cold temperatures, you have tundra and boreal forest. And then within those, we sort of divvy up our different biomes based on precipitation. So not surprisingly, at your really high precipitation levels, you have rainforests, your tropical rainforests. With a little bit less precipitation, you have tropical seasonal forests, and then with very little precipitation, you have deserts. And again, it's sort of in the temperate zone, you have the similar type thing. You have temperate coniferous forests and temperate deciduous forests at relatively high precipitation. You have temperate grasslands at intermediate precipitation, temperate shrublands at a little bit lower, and then desert. And then you have tundra kind of spanning that area with not too much precipitation and also very cold. Okay, so those are the big determinants of biomes. But again, soil texture, soil chemistry, proximity to mountains, and proximity to water bodies matter. And again, you can see that in the differences between deciduous trees and evergreen, needle-leafed evergreen trees. They have very similar precipitation levels, very similar temperatures, but it's that fertile soil versus infertile soil, that soil chemistry, that matters in determining those biomes. Proximity to mountains and water bodies matter because they actually determine things like temperature, rainfall, wind speed, that sort of thing. So they actually modify some of these broader scale patterns. All right. So if I look at the global biomes on a map, at least the 9 covered in your textbook, you can see how to sort of where they lie on the globe in general. And if I match that up with the sort of story we had a few lessons back about the latitudes where we have wet versus dry conditions, you'll see that there is sort of an alignment. So where I have really wet conditions along the equator, that's those regions of uplift, that's where I have my tropical rainforest. That's where I have the hottest and the wettest conditions on Earth. If I move a little bit away from that, I get these regions where I have, wet summers, maybe a little bit drier winters, and that's where I have tropical seasonal forests. Moving up again, I end up in those zones of subsidence where I have very dry conditions, so it shouldn't be surprising that that's where I find a lot of the deserts. I move up again and I get the dry summers and the wet winters. And again, it's hard to grow if your growing period is dry. And so that's where I end up with those temperate shrublands and woodlands, those Mediterranean climates. I move up again, and when I'm right on the border between that wet and dry zone, I tend to get boreal forests. And once I reach the dry zone, once I'm fully in that polar desert, that area of subsidence around 90, that's where I have tundra. And of course, once I get really high, I end up with polar ice, and there's no biome, there's nothing much living there. At least no large plant forms. All right, so now we're going to talk about the characteristics of the different biomes, of the 9 different biomes in your textbook. So again, tropical rainforests occur around the equator. That's where it's wettest and hottest. And so they tend to occur between 10 degrees north and 10 degrees south. They get a lot of precipitation. Again, they're in those regions of uplift. So greater than 2,000 millimeters of precipitation a year. And they typically get it either evenly throughout the year or in 1 or 2 main peaks. They are warm all the time, tend to have seasonally invariant temperatures, and that's because the equator is always about the same distance from the Earth. The northern hemisphere may be closer, the southern hemisphere may be closer, but the middle is always about the same. These are some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They actually contain 50% of Earth's species, 37% of terrestrial carbon, and 11% of vegetation cover. And the plant form that dominates in tropical rainforests are the broadleaved evergreen and deciduous trees. All right, so tropical rainforest tend to be divided into vertical layers. And so to understand really what makes up a tropical rainforest, we have to talk about those layers. The first is the emergent layer, and these are the trees that rise above the majority of the rest. Below that, we have the main canopy level, and this is the leaves of evergreen trees, and this is the majority of the forest. This is the main sort of bulk of the tropical rainforests. Underneath that, we have lianas and epiphytes. Dr. DeWalt actually studies lianas. Now, these are woody vines and plants that grow on other plants. They're kind of hanging off that canopy layer. Below that, we have the understory, which grow in the shade of the canopy, so they have to deal better with not having as much light. And then right on the forest floor, we have shrubs and forbs. So these are our broad-leafed herbaceous plants. And so you can see there's a lot of different plant forms in that tropical rainforest. But again, that main layer, that canopy layer, is evergreen trees. The next biome is the tropical seasonal forests and savannas. And again, these occur a little bit away from the equator, where we sort of have wet summers and dry winters. And these occur around about 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south. We have seasonal rainfall, and again, that's because of that shifting ITCZ. Not surprisingly, because we have less rainfall and a little bit cooler temperatures, there's lower tree densities in these regions. We also have shorter trees, and they're a little bit more drought deciduousness because they have those dry winters. Also, we have more grasses and shrubs and just fewer trees in general. So within tropical seasonal forests and savannas, there's actually 3 different vegetation complexes. They're all sort of the same, one single biome, but there's 3 kinds, there's 3 flavors. The first is a tropical dry forest, and this actually has the shortest dry season, and as a result, it tends to be dominated by broadleaf deciduous trees. And these trees drop their leaves in the dry season. And so you look at that picture, and there's quite a lot of growth going on. So again, that has the shortest dry season, the longest wet season. I move on to what's known as a thorn woodland, and you can see we've sort of drastically reduced the amount of green vegetative growth there. So that's mainly because they have a longer dry season. They have an intermediate length dry season. And so the trees can't sort of crowd in as much. They're much more widely spaced, and they're much more shrubby. They don't quite grow as big. There's a lot of herbivory in thorn woodlands, and so there tend to be thorns on the trees to protect against herbivores, and that's why they're called thorn woodlands. Then we get to what's called the tropical savanna, and these are the areas with the longest dry season. Because they have these long dry seasons, they also tend to have frequent fires. And as in any system dominated by frequent fires, you tend to get a lot of grasses because, again, grasses can grow from that base up after the fire. So you get grasses intermixed with some trees, less than in the other 2 vegetation complexes, and you get some shrubs. Again, like in the thorn woodland, there's a significant amount of herbivore grazing in some tropical savannas, not all tropical savannas. And again, some tropical savannas actually have quite a bit of flooding during the short but intense wet season. But again, that's not true necessarily of all tropical savannas. All right. Moving a bit away from the equator even further, we have deserts. And again, you should know by now that the deserts occur around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south because that's where you have that subsidence of the Hadley cell. So in these regions, all that air mass that's falling back to Earth has completely lost its rain. It's sort of moisture. It's very, very dry, and so we have very low precipitation. You can get periods of high temperature in some of these deserts. And because of that stress, particularly because of the low precipitation, but also because of the high temperatures, you get very sparse populations of plants and animals. Even though you don't have a lot of plants and animals in terms of abundance, these areas can actually be quite diverse. There's not a lot of numbers in terms of animals, but there's a lot of different kinds of animals. So the Sonoran Desert, for example, has about 4,500 plant species, 1,200 bee species, and 500 bird species. And again, that's a North American desert, so a lot of things going on there. Again, this shouldn't be a big shocker. Most of you probably know this intuitively. Deserts are dominated by succulent plants. These plants store water in their stems, and that allows them to persist through those really dry conditions. You can also get drought deciduous shrubs that drop their leaves during the dry periods, and you can get some grasses. The other thing you tend to get in deserts is short-lived annuals. We talked about the monkey flowers that are inland in California, or actually along the entire coast, along the entire west coast. So these tend to be in the more desert, dry environments. And again, the goal was to sort of get their reproductive cycle done before it got hot and dry in the summer. And so again, that's a typical strategy you see in the desert. And you can actually go out to some of the most dry, hottest places, at least in North America, for example, Death Valley, and you can see amazing wildflower blooms in March. These are all short-lived annuals that sort of get their thing done in the brief rains, and then they sort of rest dormant as seeds for the rest of the dry period. And sometimes that's just the summer, and sometimes that's multiple years. And so you actually get these mega blooms that occur every couple of years when you get a good rain. And all these seeds have been lying dormant for sometimes, 2, 3, 10 years. So just pictures of deserts. Again, sometimes we think of them as these dry areas with sand and sandhills, and that's true, that's a desert. But they can also be quite spectacular in terms of their plants and their blooms. The other picture there is the Sonoran Desert in bloom, and you can see all the wildflowers, all those short-lived annuals mixed in underneath the succulents. Okay, the fourth biome is temperate grasslands. These occur between 30 and 50 degrees north and 30 and 50 degrees south. And we learned this already in one of the previous lessons, but you find grasslands in areas where you have seasonal precipitation, and specifically where that seasonal precipitation has wet in the summer and it's dry in the winter. Again, where that rain comes at a good time, it comes in the summer when there's sort of sun and you can grow, that's where you get the grasslands. Because these are further away from the equator, you tend to get greater seasonal temperature variation. They are in the temperate zone. They are no longer in that sort of tropical zone. And you actually can get periods of sub-freezing temperatures. Partly because of the sort of dry periods, you get fires. And also because they're grasslands, you tend to get grazing. And so a lot of the animals that live in the grassland and graze it actually prevent the forest from moving in. Sadly, temperate grasslands are the most human-influenced biome on Earth. That's not surprising. They're very fertile. They're good for growing stuff. If we think about in North America, some of the most devastated biomes, some of the most devastated ecosystem, it's those Midwestern prairies. The natural prairie basically doesn't exist anymore. And so again, they are influenced because not only are they good for growing grasses, but they're good for growing this sort of grass-like crops that we like, corn, wheat, that sort of stuff. So again, as the name implies, these are dominated by grasses. And here's two pictures of different grasslands, one in Colorado and another in Russia. And you can sort of see those fields of just different wild grasses growing. All right, so the fifth biome is a little bit like the grassland. It's the temperate shrubland and woodlands. These occur between 30 degrees and 40 degrees north and 30 degrees and 40 degrees south. But they're different because even though like grasslands they have seasonal precipitation, they actually have the reverse. They have dry summers and wet winters. And that means you get most of your rain when it's not really easy to use. It's in the winter when there's not sort of sun and heat for growing and photosynthesis. Now, the one thing that is really good at growing in these temperate shrublands and woodlands is wine. So if you think about a temperate shrubland or woodland, these are sort of your wine growing country. Out in California, if you think of the wine growing regions, those are temperate shrublands and woodlands. They also occur in Europe, other places. Now, if you also think of California, there's a lot of fires. And so it shouldn't be surprising to you that these wine growing areas, in fact, some of the best wine growing areas in California burned a couple years back. Fires are common, and they actually destroy the wineries, but they actually help to promote the persistence of these temperate shrublands and woodlands. Most of these regions are associated with a rain shadow. In other words, the wet, moist air goes up over a mountain, loses all of its rain, come back down on the leeward side, and then we have sort of much drier areas. And in California, that's true. It's that inland area. If you think about the wine growing, it's not as much wine growing on the coast. You tend to have the wine growing inland a little bit from the coast. These areas are dominated by evergreen shrubs and trees, and specifically what we call sclerophyllous shrubs. So again, these were the sort of tough, leathery leaves. And if you think about those California scrubby areas, that's what those plants have. And they have those leaves because, again, their summers, when it's hot and they want to do all their photosynthesis and growing, it's really dry as well. And so they need to be able to tolerate and grow and photosynthesize during those dry summers. And they do it with those leaves that don't lose water, that can sort of continue to do photosynthesis and continue to help the plant grow even despite the dry conditions. And so again, we saw this animation in a previous lesson, but it's that difference between grassland and shrubland. They both have about the same amount of precipitation. They both have similar seasonal temperatures, but the difference is that in that Mediterranean shrubland woodland condition, we have most of our rain in the winter. That was on the left. And then in that grassland condition, we have most of our rain in the summer. That's on the right. And so again, in grassland, the rain coincides with the growing season, so that's good. In shrublands, the rain does not coincide with the growing season, and so in order to make the best of a bad situation, you have to be a sclerophyllous shrub, you have to have that sort of really tough leaves to tolerate it. All right, so again, that's the difference between Mediterranean shrubland and woodland versus grasslands. All right, moving on to the sixth biome, we have temperate deciduous forests. And these occur between 30 degrees and 50 degrees north. These are not in the southern hemisphere, interestingly enough, and that's because there's not enough land mass at the appropriate latitudes. Now, even though these don't occur in the southern hemisphere, these are probably the most familiar to you here because that's what we live in, right in this area on the east coast of the US. These areas get between 500 and 2,500 millimeters of rain, which is quite a bit. But unlike other areas that get rain, like the rainforest, the tropical rainforests, these are in the temperate zone, so there's seasonal variation in temperature and, in fact, extended periods of freezing. That may not be true entirely in this region. There's not too much extended freezing, but you see that temperate deciduous forest reach up into Canada. There's definitely some periods of freezing up there. Again, deciduous forests drop their leaves. That's what makes a tree deciduous. And in order to do that, you have to be able to afford to shed those leaves. And that means you have to grow on fertile soil where getting the nutrients to make the leaves in the first place isn't really difficult. And so these forests are deciduous trees, not surprisingly, things like oak, maple, beech, things we have around here. And they have a mix of canopy trees, shorter trees, shrubs, and forbs. This is a very typical deciduous forest. Go outside into the experimental forest in Clemson. It's also largely deciduous forest. So again, a very familiar forest type to you in this area. Another type of biome is the temperate evergreen forests. So these occur between 30 and 50 degrees north and 30 and 50 degrees south. They occur over a very wide range of temperatures, from warm coastal zones, like in the low country, to cool continental maritime climates, way up into sort of Washington and British Columbia, Washington State, even down in Australia and New Zealand. They also occur over a wide range of precipitation from 500 to 4,000 millimeters, and some are actually temperate rainforests. Again, like the name implies, they all occur in the temperate zone, but they can actually be rainforests. They get so much rain, and we see that along the coast on the Pacific side of the US. Again, the difference between these forests and the deciduous forests is that the soil is very poor. And as a result, the plants that grow there, especially the big trees, can't afford to just drop their leaves when the going gets tough. And so they hold on to their leaves. They're evergreen. And they have these sort of needle leaf kind of evergreens. Typically, the leaves tend to be acidic, and some of these areas are dominated by fire. In the northern hemisphere, most of the temperate evergreen forests are needle-leaved conifers. In the southern hemisphere, they're more diverse. They can include beeches, eucalyptus, cedar, podocarps, a lot of different trees. So here's just examples. In the northern hemisphere, we have the giant sequoias. Those are some of the most amazing temperate evergreen forests that we have in this country. An example in the southern hemisphere is this monkey puzzle tree forest in Argentina. So again, the temperate evergreen forests tend to be less diverse than the tropical or temperate deciduous forests. If you walk through a sequoia forest, it doesn't feel like there's as much going on as walking through the Smokies or walking even through the experimental forest on Clemson. And again, that's because these forests tend to be less diverse. It's maybe harder to grow in that less fertile soil. All right, the eighth biome is boreal forests or taiga. These occur above 50 degrees north. and they have continuous sub-freezing temperatures for up to 6 months of the year, and the soils regularly freeze. And as a result, you have what's known as permafrost, which is a subsurface soil layer that just remains frozen year-round for at least 3 years. These areas, again, they're on that border between the wet and dry zones. They tend to have fairly low precipitation, but the soil itself can be quite saturated, and that's because even though maybe not a lot of rain's coming out, it's also not leaving. There's very low water drainage, partly because it's just frozen all the time. There's nowhere for the water to go. These tend to be dominated by coniferous species, spruce, pine, and larch, as well as deciduous birch forests. If you go to some of these northern Canadian regions, you find huge stands of birch. And here's examples, one from Denali in Alaska and another from Quebec. Again, these boreal forests are only found in the Northern Hemisphere. They're actually, despite only being found in the Northern Hemisphere, the largest biome in area on all of the Earth. And they're about a third of Earth's forests. Because they're conifers, they tend to resist damage from winter freezing, and that's why you can find them in those very northern areas with a lot of freezing temperatures. Here's another example of a boreal forest. Looks a little bit different. These are larch, and these are actually deciduous needle-leaved trees that do drop their leaves in the fall. And it's a really phenomenal thing to see. If you could never go hiking in the fall where the larch are, there's some regions in Banff and Alberta. I've been hiking there in the fall, and it's just spectacular. These sort of Christmas tree-like forests where all the trees turn yellow and then ultimately drop their leaves. All right. The final biome is the tundra, and this occurs above 65 degrees north, and also on a few Antarctic islands. This is what we call above the tree line, so there's very low growing season temperature. It's cold all the time, even in the best of times. And then there's sort of other additional rough climate and soil conditions. So we have very low precipitation. We tend to be in those bordering onto those polar desert regions. Not surprisingly, we're even further above the boreal zone. We have permafrost. But despite this, these are some of the largest pristine regions on Earth. It shouldn't be surprising. It's hard to grow much up there, so people haven't really gotten up there and done too much. They tend to be dominated by sedges, forbs, grasses, low-growing shrubs, heaths, willows, birches, lichens, and mosses. Nothing really big because they've got that permafrost and that low amount of precipitation. So regions with permafrost are actually wet despite their low precipitation, and again, that's because that permafrost prevents percolation of the water out. The water just sits there, so even though you're not putting a lot in, you're also not removing a lot. Regions without permafrost or with coarse soil tend to be dry. That's where you find the polar deserts, and these occur at the highest latitudes, because remember, that subsidence zone theoretically occurs right at 90, right at the top. So as you move down from that, you tend to move away from the polar deserts. Here's two examples of tundra. Again, very desolate looking, but there's actually a decent amount of stuff going on, at least in the very short summer. All right, so we've talked before how mountains are a little bit like latitude, how going up in elevation is kind of similar in going up in latitude in the northern hemisphere or down in latitude in the southern hemisphere. And that's because there's similar impacts on temperature and precipitation, and so the biotic assemblages you find along a mountain elevational gradient can be quite similar to what you see in terms of latitudinal gradients. And so you start at the bottom, and frequently we have areas that are similar to grasslands and savannas. You move up a little bit and you get to the temperate evergreen and deciduous forests. You go up a little bit higher and we actually get sort of the typical boreal forest type vegetation, type biomes. And then again, as you move a little bit further up from the boreal area, you get to a transition that's quite similar from the boreal to the tundra. Once you get to the top, though, it's not exactly tundra. We call it an alpine zone. Again, these all have slightly different names, but we call that high elevation the alpine zone. It's a lot like the tundra, but there are higher wind speeds, more intense solar radiation, lower oxygen and carbon dioxide, and that makes it a little different. So again, that lower montane zone is like grasslands. Back here, we call the grassland area the lower montane zone. We call the temperate evergreen and deciduous forest the montane zone. We call the boreal forest-like area the subalpine zone, and then we call that sort of final region the alpine zone that's a little bit like tundra but also somewhat different. All right, so that's terrestrial biomes, and a little bit about sort of biomes along an elevational gradient, or the types of habitat we get along an elevational gradient. Now we're going to look at freshwater biological zones. And the factors that influence these tend to be the velocity of the water movement, the temperature, the clarity, and the chemistry. So again, the big players in terms of environmental conditions. Within chemistry, we're worried about salinity, oxygen concentration, nutrient status, and pH. So starting with water velocity, I kind of can divide my aquatic systems into two classes. One is lotic, and these are flowing water ecosystems, so rivers and streams. The other is lentic, which is still water ecosystems, including lakes and ponds. There's an example of a lotic system where I have that river flowing, and here's a lentic system where I have sort of a very still lake where you can see the reflection of the mountains. All right. Within rivers, though, I can divide it even further based on water velocity. These are all, again, lotic systems, but in a lotic system, I have what I call riffles and pools. So riffles are the really fast-moving portions of the stream where they're flowing over coarse particles. And because they're sort of agitated and bouncing around, you have a lot of increased interface with the air above, and so you get increased oxygen input into that area. Pools are deeper portions of streams where the water flows more slowly over fine sediment, and as a result, you get a decrease in oxygen input. All right. So that's lotic systems, and that's sort of broadly lotic systems, but I can also classify lotic systems based on sort of the stream size and where they come from. So my smallest streams at my highest elevation are called first-order streams. When these merge, they form what's known as second-order streams. And then the second-order streams combine to form third-order streams, and so on and so on and so on until I get down to the Nile or the Mississippi or some of those really big rivers, which tend to be sixth-order streams or higher. Now, not surprisingly, depending on the order of the stream, you get different organisms living in there. So as the stream order increases, the input from detritus from adjacent vegetation decreases relative to the water volume. At those high elevations, I don't have a lot of water volume, and they're running over all sorts of stuff on the side of the stream and pulling that in. As I get down to the bigger areas, I have a lot of water sort of in that middle, and just sort of the edges form a much less of a surface area. I'm pulling less in for the amount of water I've got. And so in addition to that, the particle size in the bed tends to decrease, and the aquatic plant growth tends to increase as I sort of increase in stream order. Because of this, the sort of detritus is different near the stream source versus further down. And so up in the higher order streams, I tend to get shredders, which are organisms that can tear up and chew those big pieces and that sort of high amount of detritus that's coming into these little streams, which is a little bit of water. As I move down to the much higher order streams where I've got a big amount of water and less detritus kind of coming in, at least relatively, I have a lot of fine organic matter, algae, macrophytes, and what I get in those areas are what are known as collectors. These are organisms that collect fine particles from the water. They can't chew up big leaves, they're just taking the little already chewed up pieces and using that. Okay. Now, we've talked a little bit about sort of lotic versus lentic. We've also talked about the broader sort of amounts of flow in the lotic systems, and we've talked about the different stream orders. But there's another way to divide streams, and that's in terms of sort of where relative to the shore you are. And so the main channel is right in the middle. And in that middle of the river or the stream, I tend to get what I call swimmers. These are your fish. You know, if I think about fish, they're not mucking through the mud for the most part. They're not sort of walking along the bottom. They're right in the middle of that main channel. Then I have what's known as the benthic zone. This is the bottom of the stream, and that's where I tend to find a lot of invertebrates, just sort of hanging out in the surface layer of the bottom stream. And then below that I have the hyporheic zone, which is the substrate just below and adjacent to the stream, and sort of that's digging into the stream mud, and that's where I find rotifers and copepods. All right, so that's lotic systems. Those are the flowing systems. Now we're going to move on to lentic systems, and most of these are temperate and polar lakes that are formed by glaciers and then the sort of carved out rock fills. However, you can also get what's known as oxbow lakes, and these form when a river ceases to flow through a former channel and it kind of gets cut off, and because it's no longer part of the flowing river, it stagnates and that forms a lake, that forms a lentic system. In terms of what grows where in a lake, again, you have different zones. Just like in rivers, you have different zones. In lakes, you have different zones. and typically the communities differ based on depth and light. So I have what's known as the pelagic zone, which is the open water. Then I have the benthic zone, which is the bottom of the lake, just like the benthic zone in the river. I also have what's called the photic zone, and this is the surface layer where the water is shallow enough that the light can penetrate, and as a result you can get photosynthesis in that zone. I also have what's called the littoral zone, which is the nearshore zone where the photic zone reaches the bottom of the lake. So out in the middle of the lake, maybe light doesn't get down to the bottom, it only gets down to the surface area, and then light doesn't get down at the very depths, but close to the shore, light gets down right to the bottom, and that's the littoral zone. All right, not surprisingly, phytoplankton can only grow where the light is. And so phytoplankton can only grow because it's photosynthesizing. Phytoplankton is photosynthetic microorganisms. It can only grow in the photic zone and the littoral zone. Zooplankton, on the other hand, is not dependent on the sun, and so it can grow everywhere in the lake. Same thing with bacteria, fungi, and fish. They don't depend on the sun, so they kind of grow everywhere. However, what's known as macrophytes, these are larger aquatic vascular plants, they need sun. They're plants. They need to photosynthesize. But they don't just need sun. If they just needed sun, they could grow in the photic zone and the littoral zone. But they actually need some place to grow out of. They need to sort of root down, and so they can only grow in the littoral zone, which is the nearshore zone, where you have both light and the plants can reach, sort of settle into the bottom, and they can still get light. All right, so that's freshwater lakes. We also have marine biological zones. And marine biological zones cover about 71% of the Earth's surface. However, marine organisms tend to be widely dispersed. There aren't maybe as many barriers to dispersal in marine systems as there are in terrestrial systems. As a result, it's not as easy to organize marine biological zones into these biological units, into biomes. However, very broadly, very generally, what you find growing where in the ocean depends on light availability, water depth, and stability of the bottom substrate. So I'm going to begin by talking about nearshore zones. These are marine zones that are sort of close to terrestrial zones. We have a couple of different types. We have estuaries, and these are junctions of a river with the ocean. And estuaries tend to be really high productivity because you have tidal variation, you have variation in salinity, and they also tend to trap terrestrial sediment. Everything washes from the river into those estuaries, and so you get this sedimentation. And actually, there's a number of South Carolina coastal estuaries, and you've probably heard about these being really productive, really good places for even growing seafood. Another type of nearshore zone that you also find in South Carolina are what's known as salt marshes. So these are formed by that terrestrial sediment that's carried to the rivers, but actually it builds up to the point where it's above the water level, and so you get vascular plants and grasses, including rushes and broadleaf herbs, growing on top of that sediment. And these are very highly productive areas, but they are subject to periodic flooding when you sort of have big tides. Because of these tides and periodic flooding, salt water comes into the salt marshes, and then the water evaporates and leaves the salt behind. And in a previous class, we talked about salinization in very dry areas. Same kind of thing here. You get salinization where salt's deposited after a flood and it remains after the water evaporates. Because the highest portions of your salt marshes flood less frequently, they tend to be the most saline. So they sort of get the salt and it kind of sticks there. Another nearshore zone that we don't tend to have in South Carolina, but you do have further down, is mangrove forests. So you don't have them in South Carolina because South Carolina is actually a temperate region. Mangrove forests only grow in tropical and subtropical regions, but these are shallow coastal estuaries and mudflats where you have salt-tolerant evergreen trees and shrubs. And we call these mangroves. They're not sort of necessarily one particular type of tree. They're, again, a plant form that we call mangroves. Another nearshore zone, again, one that's maybe less common in South Carolina, is the rocky intertidal zone. This is something you see a lot on the Pacific coast. We have rocky shorelines, and that gives a very stable substrate that animals can attach to, as well as algae. Algae can also kind of grow off that. To grow in the rocky intertidal zone, you have to exhibit tolerance to temperature change, changes in salinity, desiccation, and waves, and that's because sort of the tide keeps coming up and down and up and down, and water evaporates and it gets more salty, and then it floods again with the next tide. And if you're up high enough, you might undergo desiccation because the water's only covering you for part of the day. And again, even just the action of the waves can be very rough on the animals living there. And again, that's because that intertidal zone is the part of the shoreline affected by the rise and fall of tides, and so it actually alternates between a marine and a terrestrial environment, especially near the top where sort of it's only covered at high tide. In South Carolina, as opposed to those rocky shorelines, we actually have sandy shores for the most part. And as a result, there's no stable anchoring surface. So you don't have things like the starfish you see out on the Pacific coast or the sea anemones that you see out on the Pacific coast. You don't have that because there's nothing for them to attach to. In these sandy shores, instead, what you get is most life living beneath the sand. You got a lot of clams, sea worms, crabs, mole crabs, and they're all living in the grains of sand or under the grains of sand. You get polychaete worms, hydroids, copepods. These are all things that you'd find along your South Carolina beaches. Another type of shallow ocean zone is the coral reefs. Hopefully these last through your lifetime. Corals tend to live in close association with algae, and they build skeleton-like structures of calcium carbonate. Then sponges precipitate silica, and ultimately this results in a massive sort of reef that then provides a lot of habitat for other organisms like all the fish, eels, sharks, everything like that. So again, these are fantastic, amazingly diverse zones, but unfortunately they're very threatened. And Dr. Childress in our department has done a lot of work trying to promote awareness of coral reef damage and loss. So again, these are taxonomic, morphologically diverse animals in coral reefs, and it's the taxonomic and morphological diversity of these animals is greater than any other ecosystem, or at least any other marine ecosystem. Another type of shallow ocean zone that you might not be as familiar with is seagrass beds. These are found on subtidal marine sediments composed of mud or fine sand. And so you actually get flowering plants that grow on this sort of fine sediment mud-like stuff, and they reproduce by vegetative growth and seeds. And they're actually very similar to land plants. They have roots, stems, leaves, and flowers. Again, another similar type of shallow ocean zone is the kelp bed, and that's actually a picture of me snorkeling in a kelp bed off California. These are found in clear, shallow water, clear ocean, temperate oceans, and they're actually large stands of seaweed. These sort of many meters high seaweed plants kind of floating in the water. Now these seaweeds, these kelps, have specialized tissue that resembles leaves, stems, and roots, except as opposed to calling them leaves, stems, and roots, we actually call them fronts, stipes, and holdfasts. And these areas are really interesting because they're inhabited by a lot of unique critters like sea urchins, lobsters, mussels, abalones, and sea otters. Actually, if you go out to California, you can see the sea otters kind of hanging around in these kelp beds where they eat some of the other organisms that live there. All right, so that's the nearshore zones. Then we move out into the open ocean where kind of everything's much different. One of the big problems in the open ocean is it's challenging to remain in the photic zone. Most organisms tend to sink, and as they sink, they get out of the sort of region where the sun can penetrate. To counteract that, a lot of organisms actively try to keep themselves in the photic zone. And they do so by swimming, by using gas-filled bladders that allow them to sort of float up, by decreasing their density, by altering their chemical composition, maybe changing their salt composition. And we saw how jellyfish can adjust their salt concentrations in order to float or sink. And they can also alter, or they can be sort of evolved to have certain shapes like projections that allow them to kind of drift upward, catch upwards movement, sort of like air balloons except in water. All right. So a lot of organisms try to stay in the photic zone because that's where things are good, that's where light energy gets to and drives sort of the whole process of living. Below the photic zone, we got a number of problems. First, temperatures drop because the light's not getting there. Second, your pressures really start to rise because you've got tons and tons of water on top of you. Because of those challenges, there's fewer organisms, which means fewer organisms to eat as well. And so a lot of the things that live there tend to graze on fallen detritus, tend to graze on the sort of nutrient-rich dead stuff that falls. There are also predators, fish, crustacean cephalopods that swim around and eat the other organisms, trying to eat the detritus. Typically in these regions, the fish have weak bone structure and they lack gas bladders that might sort of compress and pop otherwise based on all that pressure above them. Even further down, right at the ocean bottom, we get to the benthic zone. This is a very sparsely populated area. It's hard to live down there. It's near freezing. The pressures down there would crush terrestrial organisms. In fact, they're so intense. You've got such a layer of water on top of you that it's hard for us to even get down there to explore them because they would crush a lot of the sort of ships or submarine type stuff we would send down there to explore. However, for those organisms that are able to get down there and to adapt to tolerate those conditions, the sediments down there can be very rich in organic matter because, as we've talked about in previous classes, dead stuff falls. And so all this dead stuff tends to fall to the bottom and get stuck there. So the types of organisms you do find down there are things like bacteria, protists, sea stars, and sea cucumbers. You do get some larger fish, some of those anglerfish that use bioluminescence to lure in prey. In reality, though, we don't really know much about this area because it is so hard for us to get down there. And so there's probably a lot of stuff going on there that we don't know about. All right, so that's our quick tour through biomes, both terrestrial and aquatic, and within aquatic, both marine and freshwater. And if you have any questions, I'd encourage you to shoot me an email.